So, all right, we are now opened up. And I'm just slowly seeing the names trickle in, which is kind of interesting to see, which is great.
Sure.
Yeah. Let's see, we've got 22, 23. Very cool. All right, Suzanne?
So welcome, everyone. I'm Suzanne Wilson. I'm the president and CEO of the Phoenix Symphony, the very proud president and CEO. And I want to thank you for joining us this evening. This is becoming a Monday night tradition for our community, our pre-concert conversation with Tito and his guests. And we thank you for joining us for this insider's perspective, giving you a little bit of the what happened behind the scenes and understanding more about the music before you listen to the broadcast. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our incredibly talented music director. We're very fortunate, Mr. Tito Muñoz. Tito, all yours.
Thank you so much. And it's great to be here with Glenn Stallcop, one of our bassists, former bassists from the Phoenix Symphony, and also a wonderful composer. Thank you for being here, Glenn.
Oh, great. That's wonderful.
So I wanted to actually start off the conversation maybe with a little bit of your history with the orchestra. You retired at the end of last season, is that correct? Or I should say officially the end of last season, but the season
officially before. The end of last season.
Correct.
Yeah.
You took a sabbatical to test the waters out and see what it was like. But you want to take us back to where music started for you and where that kind of passion, you found that passion?
Music started for me. I was interested in music when I was very young, but it didn't really start to me till my mother bought a piano when I was 10 years old, and I immediately requisitioned it and started playing on it. And she had bought it for herself, but she didn't get to play it much over the next several years. So I would play the piano, and then when I was about 12 or so, I grew very fast. I think I grew about 10 inches in 4 months or something like that. And my music teacher saw me and said, "You have to play the bass." So that's when I started to play the bass. And I had already started to write music at that point, and I thought, oh, that's a good way to learn how the orchestra works and what's going on with the orchestra. So that was when I started to. The bass got me into the orchestra, and then the orchestra turned out to be what I did.
Your life, yeah. And you grew up in Seattle, is that correct?
Yes, I grew up in Seattle.
And what your first orchestral experience was that also the Seattle Youth Symphony?
That was aside from playing in school, that was my first orchestral experience.
Where did the love of writing music eventually come into play?
When did it come into play? Well, I was doing it from the beginning. I was writing from the beginning, and I'm not sure why, except that I figured out pretty quickly that if you're writing music, nobody can tell you what to do. So I decided that this was a good thing to pursue because you were always right.
I suppose that's true. That's amazing. And so the Phoenix Symphony has played many of your pieces throughout your time with the orchestra. This particular piece that we performed and that our audiences are going to hear tonight, City Music, was a piece that you wrote essentially the first year that you were a member of the Phoenix Symphony. We could chat a little bit about the piece first, and then we can talk about other things. But I wonder if you sort of take us through the impetus of it and what is it that you try to get across artistically with this particular work?
Well, the best that I can imagine or remember, it was a while ago, it was my first year here was 73, 74, 1973, 74. And I had come from Seattle, and I had gotten a job with the symphony, and things looked rosy here. I wasn't a great job, but it was, people were all excited about how the city was growing and how the community was growing. And we had a good music director in Eduardo Mata, and it was fun to play here. I felt pretty good about it. And that the summer after my first year, I decided that I would write a piece for the conductor of the Seattle Youth Symphony, who had been my mentor growing up in school, and had also played some of my music that I had written in high school. And so I thought I would try to write him a really good piece and see if he would play it. And so I wrote a piano version of it that summer, and went up late in the summer and played it for him. And he said, "Let's do it." So then it took me another year or so to do the orchestration for it. And he premiered it in 1976, so 2 years later. And then after the premiere, I showed it to Eduardo Mata, and he did it in 1978.
That's wonderful. And the piece is in two movements.
Yes.
And what the title City Music, there is certainly a sense of liveliness, hustle and bustle, and especially in the second movement. But what was your inspiration for the piece, and for the musical language in the piece, I should say?
Yeah, I think because of when I wrote it, things were different then, of course. But the biggest thing I think that was different was that orchestras were not doing pops concerts. So they were still thinking of what you'd have to say colloquial music as being source material. So whereas we had some very American composers in Aaron Copland, and then later Leonard Bernstein, a lot of popular music had changed a great deal during the 1960s. So which was my generation. So when I started to write music after getting out of college, I decided I would look to the music that I really enjoyed listening to, which was rock and roll, and the jazz that was going on at that time, which was fusion jazz. And so that's where I took my inspiration for this piece. And it was different. I really liked Leonard Bernstein, but he was sort of a bop and swing kind of composer, and I was not into that. I was into the more hard stuff. So that's where I got my inspiration. But it's an orchestral piece. It's not a popular piece.
Right.
And we were all looking for the great American composer who took American music and made great music out of it. So that was the impetus from that. It just didn't work out like that. We just started playing it, playing popular music in the 80s, and so things were didn't work out that way. So, but this is sort of pre-pops concerts.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely hear there is a special language of that that the 60s sort of generation even of American composers, the Paul Crestons, the Roger Sessions, or even earlier, like where you're hearing that music kind of become part of the American landscape around that time, and you're having a lot of orchestras playing that kind of music. But but taking sort of hard rock and or even blues scales and these kinds of things, and really transforming it into something that is truly an orchestral piece. I mean, this is hardcore large orchestra piece.
Yeah.
Is really, I think, really very unique for the time, because I don't know of any other pieces that were kind of doing that particularly. Like you mentioned Leonard Bernstein, but Leonard Bernstein was writing jazz, was writing bop, he was writing different kinds of things, but not quite what you were writing.
Generation. This was a lot. That what happened was that a lot of the people who were really into that started getting together rock bands and playing serious music.
Right.
In the 70s particularly, there was I wish I could think back and get some examples, but there was a lot of really written music for rock band. Emerson, Lake and Palmer and was something Crimson. There were bands that were doing very serious, complicated music with rock bands, which is sort of the opposite of what I did. But it was an interesting time coming out of the 60s. And one of the unique things about the 60s, as opposed to pop music that came afterwards, was that it was very blues oriented. You got Eric Clapton's and Jimi Hendrix and these guitar players who were taking their style from B.B. King and other blues players, and as rock progressed from that time, the blues sort of filtered itself out of it, and you get a more hard rock into the 80s and 90s, and you don't hear any blues at all. It's sort of
that transition between between those decades, that harmony starts to go away. Absolutely, that harmonic progression, it completely evaporates.
It becomes when you hear that, very, very loud folk music is what it
right. But I feel like that kind of focus on still having that harmonic language very sort of clear in the music. For me, I feel like it adds this wonderful richness to it that and offers the ability to be a little bit more complicated with the musical language inside of it, rather than kind of this on the surface, like you're saying, this kind of loud exterior.
Yeah. Well, blues is very expressive harmonically and melodically. It uses a lot of harmonic dissonance and very it's a lot more direct emotionally than the kind of block sounds that came afterwards. And I think if you're writing instrumental music, you're not writing vocal music. It's a much more lucrative source material than what came later. So
no, that makes sense for sure. What was the response like when you first heard the work way back when?
When I first heard it, I was thinking about little things, of course, but the response to the work was very good, and even after we played it here in when was it? 1978. People were still coming up to me and telling me they remembered it 20 and 30 years later. They remembered it and they were really impressed by it. So it had a good response then. And the biggest compliment I got was from Eduardo Mata, who programmed the piece with Isaac Stern, playing with the Beethoven
oh wow
concerto. So I was, you know, and so we had a packed house, and it was a big deal for me.
How interesting that because this is a Beethoven pairing as well. So that's very, very interesting that's the, that's the the connection. Amazing. What I mean, I'm always fascinated by, because I did spend a little time when I was in school writing music, somewhat. I was never very good at it, but I'm always interested by composers and what their emotions are when they have released a piece into the world, and it's now in the hands of somebody else to make it go, and what's sort of going on in your mind when you're sitting either at a first reading of a piece or even at a performance when it's happening. When it's happening.
The first time I heard an orchestra piece of mine performed, I was so thrilled that it lasted for decades. You know, it used to be that you had to write the music, you know, and hear it cold turkey. You didn't get the computerized versions that you get now. So you
also wrote it by hand back then. It wasn't. That's the whole thing. Yeah.
Yes, and copied it by hand, and it took forever. And
it still takes forever.
It still takes forever.
It still takes forever.
But new music was always accompanied by the smell of ammonia, because the process that they used to make oscillate copies would give an ammonia odor to the new music. It was printed, so it was all, you always knew you were doing new music when the ammonia wafted from it. But yeah, it was a long process, and I didn't hear the piece for nearly a year and a half since I started working on it, and then when I heard it, it was just like, wow, that worked. A lot of it really worked. And you know, sometimes you write something and it didn't work. I wrote a piece just a couple years later, and I went and heard that, and it didn't work. You know? It was just it's too thick. I should have pared it down, you know. And sitting music was quite a bit longer when I first wrote it, and it was just too long. It was just too much time in the seat listening to it. So I made some cuts on it, and it took me. Of course, you making cuts again. You don't have the computer to try it out on. You have to make the cuts and then wait till the next.
Hope for the best.
So it really didn't reach this final version for a number of years later, and 2 or 3 performances before I finally got it to where it was really tight and concise.
Mm-hmm. What is that like? Those moments where you feel like it doesn't work, and what happens? I mean, what do you do when that happens?
Now you have those moments at home, so you can try some things. And now I've been doing this for so long that a lot of it has become sort of right brain. You know, I just listen to it and I say, oh, that's too long, or
sure.
This is getting boring. You know, I need to do something here. But often the fixes are sort of hidden sometimes. It may be just a moment that takes your mind off of what you've been doing. You'll do something and it'll go somewhere for just maybe 10 bars or something, but those 10 bars lose your attention. So you can just, if you can work around those 10 bars, make a cut or make a patch of some sort. Often, you know, you've gotten rid of the problem, and then it just flows right ahead.
Yeah.
But usually it's a stop of momentum.
Mhm.
I mean, some stops of momentum are very effective, but some just make you lose attention. So,
Right. Right.
it's it just depends on the music. So,
I would imagine so. I would imagine it depends on the performance of it as well, you know, because certainly that's a that can that can make or break. I mean, we talk about Beethoven, and we have Beethoven on this concert, and Beethoven's like, you know, the epitome of, you know, a composer not being able to get good performances of their pieces. When you think about the shoddy first performances of Beethoven's works. I mean, the violin concerto, the Sixth Symphony, the Fifth Piano Concerto. You know, that there was that big marathon concert that the the Sixth Symphony was premiered at. That, you know, they had no rehearsal and it was just a mess and nobody liked anything that he wrote, and which can be a bit of a problem for a composer to be able to actually, you know, get a good sense of the effectiveness of something, you know, and I would imagine that's a big part of it too.
Yeah, it certainly used to be. The performance would make a lot of big difference. And, you know, all these years, of course, I've been having performances and having tapes. And earlier it was tapes. Now it's just recordings. And some of those are, you don't like to listen to.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But it's all you have, you know. I mean, now that's not the case. You have all this sampled orchestral stuff, and you can make your own recordings. But it used not to be that way. So
that's correct. Yeah. So for everybody who might have not have tuned in earlier, just we are joined by former Phoenix Symphony bassist Glenn Stallcop, who is also an extremely accomplished composer, and in fact we performed one of his pieces last season, is what you're going to hear tonight, his city music of 1976, and along with the Beethoven, the very rarely performed beautiful Beethoven Mass in C major. I wanted to talk, Glenn, a little bit about your Phoenix Symphony career, but it more in the sense of maybe the day-to-day, and what experiences sort of do you feel are very unique to a symphony musician, as opposed to almost anybody else, as far as the kind of work, the week-to-week work, the day-to-day work? What do you feel sort of makes that specifically unique to a symphony player?
Well, for me, and I suppose there are different responses to this, but for me, what makes the job so special was working with so many people on such a close level, and it's not just the camaraderie. It's the working environment of creating something. You're trying to make something beautiful and something wonderful, and you're working very hard with so many people, and you get to know, because music is music, and it sort of betrays your inner feelings as you're playing. So you get to know your colleagues like they're your brothers and sisters. I mean, it's you know them very closely, and that experience of working with people like that every day. I mean, there's just no other job that I can think of that is like that, where you have that kind of camaraderie and that kind of closeness between your colleagues.
I feel like it's that mean for me, that would be my response as well. I mean, I think that the act of making music with somebody else is such a strangely psychologically intimate thing to do, that, you know, but it's inevitable. You have to do that. That's what making music actually is. And when you're literally,
it's not intimate, it's not good.
It's not good. Exactly. It's not music making. It's nothing. And so it's strange. And so it's not even just being at an office together. It's actually, there's an actual interaction that's unique to that, that is so special, and not you can't replicate it any other way. You have to actually be in a room with somebody to be able to actually do this, not only with the other musician that you might be performing with, but with the audience that's receiving the performance as well. That, you know, that's what makes what we do. That's what makes, I think, this time right now where we're being socially distant is so difficult, because with all the wonderful, with all the wonderful virtual performances that are sort of popping up on the internet, it's not quite, you know, the thing that we do, you know, and there's a reason why we do what we do, which I think is particularly special. So that I like hearing that. That's really, really wonderful. And what about the variety of music? You know, because you mentioned, for example, when, you know, you first wrote City Music, that Pop's concerts, for example, weren't really a thing at that point yet. I mean, some orchestras were kind of doing it, but not like we are doing it now.
And they weren't like what we ended up doing.
Right.
They were light classics.
Light classics, exactly.
Light classics. So they were not popular. That like popular became. So, I mean, you know, we were doing Led Zeppelin concerts, and
so we're still, you know, that's what's going on. What was that like for you, that kind of evolution, seeing how the orchestra's repertoire really changed?
Well, you know, I think being an oldster now, I can look back and see how it evolved and changed. And, you know, when I was just starting out, classical music was under the influence of recording, in the sense that the recording had brought classical music to a whole new audience of people. I mean, it used to be that you had to have money and be in the right place to go to hear a classical music concert. And as we got really high fidelity recording coming out of the 50s and 60s, the really good recording environments, that the classical music was, you know, all of a sudden spread to a very large audience. And so orchestras were playing to large audiences, and it was spreading out and becoming very popular. And then they ran out of repertoire, because, you know, popular music, the repertoire was turning over all the time, and right. There's just so many different ways you can play a Beethoven symphony, and people don't really get the difference. And so, I mean, it was not only changing the audience view of the repertoire, it was changing the musician's view of the repertoire.
Of course, and that's the trickiest thing, I think, is that you kind of get stuck in a way, especially with auditions, having the excerpts being a certain way all the time, and there's this kind of like, that's what's really, really tough. Unfortunately, we're going to have to actually stop, because we have 1 minute left before the the thing. So this 30 minutes go by so fast. Glenn, I want to just thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to hear your piece, and all of you attending can hear it at www.kbaq.org or on KBAQ if you're in Phoenix. So I hope you enjoy it. Glenn, thank you again, and stay safe.
Well, thank you so much, Tito. It's a great pleasure.
Absolutely. And take care, everybody. Thank you so much for joining.
Okay.